Welcome, everyone, to the Friday, February 21st, 2025 episode of On Iowa Politics. This week on the podcast, Governor Kim Reynolds may have accidentally announced her re-election campaign. Congresswoman Mariannette Miller-Meeks is getting a primary rematch. And legislative proposals to ditch the Outdoors Recreation Trust Fund and remove gender identity from the Iowa Civil Rights Act. Hello, everyone. I'm Erin Murphy, the Des Moines Bureau Chief for the Gazette in Cedar Rapids. With me this week, our Gazette Deputy Bureau Chief, Tom Barton. Good morning, Tom.
Good morning, Erin.
We have Lead Des Moines Bureau Chief, Marchel Hoff. Hello, Maya.
Good morning, Erin.
Sarah Watson checking in from the Quad City Times. Hello, Sarah.
Greetings, Erin.
And Gazette columnist Todd Dorman is here. Hello, Todd.
Hello.
All right, so I have to tell you that, wow, was it a newsy week on the Iowa government and politics beat. You just heard all the stuff that we're going to be talking about today, and that means on the cutting room floor for this week's episode are Auditor Rob Sand versus Governor Kim Reynolds on auditing education savings accounts, bills on obscene materials in libraries and children at drag shows at the legislature, and fired federal workers in Iowa speaking out. I mean, those are four topics that would make a really, really good podcast lineup on almost any other week. And we're not going to get to any of them today. Just a remarkable week. But we have to start this one with the news that broke Thursday afternoon, and we're recording Friday morning this week. On Thursday afternoon, an Iowa House Republican bill was introduced that proposes to remove gender identity as a protected class from the Iowa Civil Rights Act, where it was placed in 2007. The move effectively would remove legal protections for discrimination against transgender Iowans in employment and wages, public accommodations and services, housing, education, and more. We had been hearing for weeks that such a bill might be coming, and on Thursday afternoon it arrived. It was introduced as a committee bill by Iowa Representative Steve Holt, a Republican from Denison and chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. The bill does other stuff too. It would also delete the definition of gender identity in state law, define the terms male and female by their corresponding reproductive systems, declare that, quote, separate accommodations are not inherently unequal, unquote, and require that any new birth certificate in which a person's sex changes to also include a designation of the person's sex at birth. I want to bring Todd in on this. I'll remind listeners that Todd is a columnist and opinion writer, so that's why I swing this one to you, Todd. But I'm curious to get your reaction to this bill.
Well, if this moves forward, of course, we're sort of in uncharted territory. Gender identity was put in the Civil Rights Act in Iowa in 2007 when the Democrats had a trifecta. And so it's been on the books for 18 years. I'm not sure what the problems it's caused are, but I'm sure Representative Holt and his allies can think up something or make up something. Either way, it's also would be the first time that the state has ever tried to basically erase the identity of a minority group by making it virtually impossible for them to for there to be any government documents or anything that refers to them by their preferred gender. Everything is tied to the gender they were born with. So those are big, sort of scary provisions, and transgender people are rightly worried that, I mean, not only are they once again being punched by the legislature, but this is going to mean, they can be discriminated against in housing, for jobs. I mean, their life is going to be made appreciably worse by a legislative action, which is something. It sounds like maybe the subcommittee is going to meet Monday. I don't know if that's the correct. something like that.
Let me check on that as we talk, and I'll get back to you. As of when
Okay.
I filed the story last night, it hadn't been scheduled yet, but I'd be shocked if it's not coming soon. So I'll check while you keep talking here.
And that will be sort of the first test. We'll see who shows up to oppose the bill. In past years, business and economic development groups have opposed the bill because they think it's bad. Discrimination is bad for business. If those folks don't show up this time, then you can pretty much assume that with the Trump anti-trans orders and the political atmosphere at the legislature, that the business groups are just gonna duck out of this and not put their heads up above the trench. So that'll be interesting to see. Well, it'll be interesting to see whether it passes. Then from there, you've got the Judiciary Committee. There's already some sign that at least not every Republican is going to be for this. Austin Harris, who represents a district in South Central Iowa, wrote on Twitter that I will oppose stripping Iowans of their civil right protections with every fiber of my being. So surprisingly, I looked at the comments, and although he's taking criticism, there were also a lot of sort of attaboys. People liked that he was taking that stand. Yeah, does this have the support to get through the committee and the House and the Senate? I mean, we don't know that yet. The bill has come up before. Subcommittees have met on it, and nothing happened. But I have a feeling this time it's a much more serious threat.
Yeah, I mean, it's a new legislature, an even bigger majority in both chambers. But you do raise a fair question there. We still don't know that. I presume at the very least it's going to pass out of that first subcommittee, given the two Republicans on it are Holt himself, and then new Republican representative Samantha Fett, who's, based on what we know of positions she's had on other legislation. I'm making an assumption here, so if I prove to be wrong, so be it. But I think we can safely say that she will be a supporter of this bill. So at the very least, it's going to go to Holt's Judiciary Committee. We'll see how it would fare there.
Yeah. Well, and we'll also learn something from how fast they try to do something like this. If they have the votes, then I imagine that it will pass pretty quickly, because they're going to have the rotunda filled every day with protesters. So they'd rather just pass it and move on. But of course, the people it's going to subject to discrimination, the only way they can move on is if they move out of state.
And to that, it has not officially been scheduled yet as we sit here again and record early Friday morning. But like I said, I expect that to change soon. To Todd's point, I can't imagine they sit on this. We're going to see a subcommittee on that sooner than later this week. A couple other things I wrote it down that I want to circle back on some points you made, Todd. Right off the bat, you said something about uncharted territory, and to drill that down, I haven't had a chance yet to vet this, but one of the advocacy groups said, and I presume they wouldn't say this unless they had done the homework first, but just for the sake of clarification, I haven't vetted this. They said that this would literally be the first time in the country that any state has removed a protected class from their Civil Rights Act, which is, not an insignificant sentence to say.
They're probably right. I mean, I was covering the legislature in 2007 when sexual orientation and gender identity were added, and gender identity was not an issue because of the time period. The main issue was that Republicans were afraid that this would somehow lead to legal same-sex marriage, which was the big issue of the day. Gender identity, I don't recall even, drawing a lot of criticism. And,
isn't that fascinating? Yeah.
Yeah. But, and part of it is once the family leaders of the world and such lost the marriage fight, they had to look for a new scapegoat. And I think transgender Iowans is who they landed on. That's who they're targeting. I mean, if you don't have someone to scare people with, it hurts your fundraising and all of that. Bob Vanderplatz needs a new pair of shoes. So yeah, it's a lot of things coming together at the same time.
And the other thing, Todd, sorry, I wanted to just elaborate on real quick. You mentioned you kind of spoke about, I wrote down the word in shorthand, erasure here. You talked about the government essentially effectively not even acknowledging a transgender person's existence after if such a law like this would pass. And if anybody's not sure what Todd's talking about there, that's why I listed one of the things in the that I listed that the bill does, requiring a birth certificate if it gets changed to still say the individual's sex at birth. So what transgender Iowans will tell you is that if a transgender person gets a new birth certificate to reflect their current gender identity, if the state says, but that still has to say the sex you were at birth, to that transgender person, that's effectively, denying your gender identity. And there's other examples of the bill that I didn't list, including that like any government data that's collected can only recognize male and female. I did list that it literally removes the definition of gender identity from state law. So when Todd talks about erasure, that's what folks are talking about.
Well, and one other thing that I'll say is I talked about whether Republicans are going to support this. The other question is how strenuously are Democrats going to oppose the bill if it starts to move forward? I mean, there was a lot of postmortems after the 2024 election that, basically indicated, hey, we need to get uncoupled from this transgender rights issue. It's a political loser. I mean, Republicans have won the day messaging on it, and so let's not emphasize it. So here it is on the plate in front of them. It'll be interesting to see what their reaction is.
Yep. And the last one I wanted to update, because Todd, you also mentioned, you said it'll be interesting to hear the arguments that Republicans who support this will make for it. It was late last night. It was like 9:00 when I finally heard back from Representative Holt and had to update my story. So it wasn't in my original story for a while, but it is updated to reflect that last night. And his early statement, a key portion of it was his belief that because of some of the laws they've passed in recent years about, transgender Iowans having to use bathrooms that correspond with their, birth or biological sex, the transgender girls can't play in girls' sports, the ban on gender affirming care for transgender children, stuff like that. Representative Holt said his concern is that so long as gender identity is protected in the Civil Rights Act, those laws are in legal threat, in legal danger. And so he believes that in order to protect those laws, they have to remove gender identity from the Civil Rights Act. So that's one of the key early arguments, at least in support of this one.
Well, it is important to protect laws. The poor things, they don't even have arms and legs to defend themselves. And but protecting people is an entirely different matter, apparently. So
he argued that women need protection and that this bill does that too. And that's the old argument that women are in danger because of transgender individuals, which on any kind of scale at all has not been proven to be an issue. Well, obviously, a huge one that we'll be talking about in future episodes. But to Todd's point, I'm sure next week, because I'd be shocked if there's no subcommittee hearing on that this week. And I don't place many bets, but if I were comfortable putting some money down, I'd be pretty comfortable betting that will be an intensely debated bill as it works through the legislative process. Again, no committee scheduled yet. Guessing that's going to change soon. Meantime, Moving on, there was another bill this week that was introduced and that was passionately debated at the Iowa Capitol. Senate Republicans have proposed doing away with the Natural Resources and Outdoor Recreation Trust Fund and replacing it instead with a trust fund for property tax relief. The Natural Resources and Recreation Trust Fund, if you're not familiar, has been empty ever since its creation in 2010 because the trigger to fund it, which is any increase in the state sales tax, never happened. But that didn't stop folks from having very strong feelings about giving up on the trust fund and creating another state fund for tax relief instead. On the flip side, there were some folks who came to the Capitol and spoke passionately in favor of the proposal at its first legislative hearing this week. Maya, you were in that very crowded hearing room. Tell us all about it.
Yeah, Erin, you're right. It was extremely crowded. It was filled to the brim. People were spilling out the doors with farmers, folks from Farm Bureau, conservationists, folks with conservation groups or groups that spend a lot of time focusing on conserving lands like Ducks Unlimited, Iowa Ducks Unlimited. And yeah, before I get into the nitty gritty of kind of what happened during the subcommittee meeting, all the arguments, what's going on, the trust fund that we're talking about, the Natural Resource and Outdoor Recreation Trust Fund, that was first voted on by the voters by 63% in 2010, allocates money, like you said, if there's any sort of sales tax increase. It funds things like improving soil, water, and air quality conservation, increasing outdoor recreational opportunities, funding watershed protection and management, things like that. States in the Midwest also have these types of trust funds. Minnesota and Missouri both have them. And unlike Iowa, they have both put money into them since their creation. So they're actually funding these things versus Iowa hasn't, right? Because there hasn't been any sales tax increase. But the big argument or arguments that happened at the subcommittee were kind of looking at conservation of lands and outdoor recreation versus protecting farmland and from being acquired by the Department of Natural Resources and using the trust fund instead to focus on property tax relief. The bill would basically shift the fund from the current fund to one that would address property tax relief. And again, that would only happen under the same guidelines if there was ever a sales tax increase. And to just provide clarity, if there were a sales tax increase under both of the trust fund and the proposed one, 0.375% or 3/8 of every penny of increased sales tax would be going to these funds. If this resolution is successful, it would need to be approved by lawmakers after the 2026 elections in either the 2027 or 2028 sessions, and then it would go before voters in 2028. And there are 17 Senate Republicans who co-sponsored the resolution. So some of them are making it clear that they want this to go through and that they're behind it. Tom was able to talk to a House Republican who expressed different feelings about it. Representative Mike Sexton, who chairs the House Agriculture Committee, expressed skepticism about the proposal, and he suggested that it probably isn't the right approach for property tax reduction.
So never to say never, Maya, but unlike the first bill we talked about here, where we're not sure about its future, that was a pretty strong indication of how, at least, I mean, never say never, but right now it doesn't sound like House Republicans are super interested in this one, right?
Yeah. I mean, just based off of what Tom heard from Representative Sexton, he was kind of taken off guard by it. And again, lawmakers are looking to address property taxes, a thing that many Iowans are concerned about, but he said that this probably isn't the right way to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, it's worth noting that property tax, or excuse me, that taxpayer advocacy groups are not registered in support of the bill. one would assume, because in order to achieve the property tax reduction, you have to raise another tax. So you're raising the sales tax, you're raising run tax essentially to lower another. And so, the fact that Iowans for tax relief and again, other taxpayer advocacy groups, that they're not registered in support of this bill, probably is an indication that it's not going to get much traction from House Republicans, from conservatives, who support and are backed by those groups, and again want to see property tax relief, but don't want it to end up being a shell game, right? That it's going to be true property tax relief, true tax relief, not just, I guess, property tax relief. You know what I'm saying? That yes, your property tax bill will be lower, but at the same time, you potentially will be paying, more when you go out and buy, goods through that sales tax.
Yeah, and to that, Iowans for tax relief didn't even testify at the subcommittee hearing. Now, I will say I haven't talked to anyone from the group, so I don't know. Maybe they planned to and saw the glut of humans at the doorway there for that committee hearing and decided it wasn't worth trying to fight through there. But for whatever it's worth, right, Maya, they didn't even come to testify at the hearing.
No. And kind of to get into the points of the folks that were at the subcommittee, on one side of it, you had, kind of the conservationist group, but also just Iowans there in their own personal capacity, arguing that if this trust fund were to be repealed or done with, it would cause a number of issues. One, it would, if there were a sales tax increase to fund this fund, right? This is kind of all hypothetical or theoretical, but it would not put more resources towards water, soil, and air conservation, which a lot of folks are concerned about in Iowa. They argued that Iowa has the second most cases of cancer nationally and the only state with rising cases of cancer, and argued that this is a totally different can of worms, but that those numbers are being driven by pesticide use and pesticides and herbicides that farmers are using. They also argued that without funding outdoor recreational opportunities, it would make Iowa not as competitive in attracting younger folks or just folks in general to join the workforce. Iowa's experiencing a brain drain, so they said that could hit that without improving or funding these opportunities that would attract folks to the state. On the other side of it, you had a lot of farmers. You had folks from the Farm Bureau, of course, and they were arguing that they do really, really want to see property tax relief. They've been hit hard by that. And they also argued that they are nervous, or they've experienced the DNR coming in and acquiring their land for recreational uses or just public and government use. Just to kind of put some numbers by that, Iowa actually ranks near the bottom of the list of U.S. states for its share of publicly owned land. About 3% of the state is public land, according to a Texas A&M University Natural Resources Institute study. And in 2022, Iowa had 30.5 million acres of farmland, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and then nearly 400,000 acres of land in Iowa are currently managed by the DNR. And if this fund were ever to be funded by a sales tax increase, right, there are different buckets that the money would go into, and one of them is the Iowa Resources Enhancement and Protection Fund, and that is what the money put towards land acquisition for multiple purposes, and that would be only 13% of the whole fund. So
that's the current one you're talking about, yeah, not the proposed.
Yeah,
yep.
the current Natural Resources and Outdoor Recreation Trust Fund.
One thing that's interesting about that public land number is that a significant part of that is interstate medians.
Is that right?
Yeah, that counts as state-owned land. All the wow. Strips of grass between 4-lane highways.
I did not know that.
I've vacationed on the medians of Iowa, and I can tell you that they're loud, really loud, but picturesque. I mean, so yeah. It's worth noting also the Farm Bureau campaigned against this when it was brought up in 2010, and so yeah,
And
they're back.
they're literally the only lobbying organization in support of the
Yeah,
new proposal.
if
As
you look
as of when the hearing was held, I guess I should say that I haven't looked. It's been updated in the last few days, but remind me which committee that's in the Senate. Do you know
That was
about that?
on the state government.
State government. Okay. So it'll be interesting to see the next steps for that. Again, what kind of future that has in the Senate. As noted, thanks to the intrepid work of Tom, we know how they feel about it, at least early on in the House. Now, as we always say around the Capitol, nothing's dead until they gavel out in April. So even if it gets struck down now, does that become a bargaining chip depending on how badly Senate Republicans decide they want it at the end of session? I have no idea. There's a lot of bills kind of emerging like that where there really seems to be only interest on one side of the rotunda. So I'm getting a little bit nervous about what the end of session negotiations might look like this year. I hope I'm wrong and just overreacting to that, but bills like this is what make me think April may not be, and it may be a May exit. I hope I'm wrong, but it'll be interesting. Let's move on. So much to get to. Also at the Capitol this week, Governor Kim Reynolds was fielding some questions during a press conference about an announced Republican candidate for governor, former state legislator Brad Sherman, when one of Reynolds' answers was worded in a way that sort of tipped her hand on whether she's running for re-election. She has not yet made an official announcement, and thus far had been cagey when asked directly about it. But boy, it sure seemed like she inadvertently answered the question this week. Tom, you were in the room where it happened. Note the pacing of that phrase there. Tell us exactly what the governor said.
Yeah, so the presumption is that the governor will run for re-election for another term in 2026. So, as you said, she was asked about former state lawmaker Brad Sherman, former one-term House lawmaker and pastor from Williamsburg, who on Monday threw his hat in the ring, saying that he's running for governor, and was asked about his candidacy, his campaign, and having a potential primary challenger who would be trying to run to the right of Kim Reynolds in a primary, someone who was an early endorser of President Donald Trump's campaign ahead of the 2024 Iowa GOP caucuses. And Reynolds, was asked about that and asked about Trump's support, and if she, were to run, if she would be worried about having Brad Sherman as a challenger, and whether she thinks that she would get Trump's support if she were to seek another term. And Reynolds responded saying that she has a good relationship with Trump, and pointed out his comments about policies, the governor's policies that have been enacted in Iowa. She said, the president often talks about things that Reynolds and Republican lawmakers in the state have done related to education reform in the state, and for example, the education savings accounts that they passed, allowing taxpayer funds to be used by Iowa families to help send children to private schools. She also talked about the government efficiency efforts and initiatives that she's undertaken in the last couple of years. She had her big government realignment bill a couple of years ago, and talking about the praise that President Trump has given her for government efficiency, and then where she kind of tipped her hand was she talked about that she said, quote, "I'm going to run on my record." And said, she would love a Trump endorsement, but then said, I'm running on my record. I'm going to run on what we've done for Iowans since I've been elected, and I'm proud of that record. We've gotten a lot done in a short time. So, that would seem to indicate that, yes, she is running for re-election. And when she was asked about that or pressed to clarify, she kind of walked that back and instead said, stay tuned. There might be some news coming, just not today. So stay tuned. But again, from speaking to political observers in this state, on both sides of the political spectrum, again, the presumption is that Governor Reynolds will run for re-election. I reached out to Jimmy Centers. He's a former communications director for the Terry Branstad, Kim Reynolds gubernatorial administration. He's a Iowa Republican strategist who's worked on presidential, congressional, gubernatorial and legislative campaigns in the state, asking him about Sherman's bid for governor and potentially, running in a primary against Reynolds, and said that the governor is well positioned to win a Republican primary. She's raised about 1.8 million last year, I think, according to her last campaign finance report, and I think she had about 3 million cash on hand. So she has a large fundraising advantage. She'll also likely receive outside support from the Republican Governors Association. He, essentially backed the governor up and said, that she's going to run on a very strong track record, that conservatives and Iowans support. That includes cutting taxes, consolidating state agencies, and allowing Iowa families to use taxpayer dollars to choose K-12 education options that best fit their children, including private schooling options. When Brad Sherman was in the Iowa House, his voting record, largely aligned with supporting the governor's policy agenda and proposals. There was a question there as to how Brad Sherman would work to contrast himself with Kim Reynolds in a primary. Looking at his record in the Iowa House, his big thing was putting forward legislation that didn't end up advancing. Was not successful to ban same-sex marriage in the state and to essentially completely outlaw abortion in Iowa. Don't know if that's going to be his campaign strategy, if that's going to be a significant part of his campaign. According to his campaign website, one of his issues is medical freedom. So that's going to be a key issue of his campaign, along with mental health, human trafficking education. Said that, if he were to be elected governor, that he would sign legislation reducing emergency powers of the governor to what he says is impose unconstitutional shutdowns that harmed businesses and families during the COVID-19 pandemic, and that he would work to, quote, dismantle the bureaucratic swamp that was responsible for the iron hand of tyranny that we saw from the medical establishment during COVID. In his announcement, he also talked about defending Iowans' rights against eminent domain abuse, encouraging fiscal responsibility, promoting family values, and returning government to, quote, foundational principles that made America great.
When I introduced this, I should clarify. You made a great point, Tom. This isn't super surprising that Reynolds is going to run for re-election. That was kind of the understanding, and we were going to hear an announcement at some point. So it's not like some bombshell that she kind of had a slip of the tongue, and it was just kind of kind of a funny, interesting moment because she'd been protecting that official announcement. Obviously, they like to, first of all, they have candidates always have their reasons for when they want to announce. Some of it has to do with fundraising considerations and laws and just general timing of the news. So for whatever reason, Reynolds wasn't ready to yet. She pretty clearly was going to at some point. But so just because of that, it was kind of funny when she kind of started talking like a current candidate there, speaking in the present tense, and kind of let the cat out of the bag. The cat was already 3/4 the way out the bag anyways. This essentially did it. I will say there was a point when that was an open question, but that's whether she would run for re-election for another term. But that's not the sense anymore. That it's very widely expected that she would.
I would also just quickly throw out, it's also not surprising to see that she may get or would have a primary challenger. You know, we've seen we've seen in the last couple of election cycles, especially just this past election cycle last year, that you know, more MAGA aligned anti-establishment candidates running to challenge you know, popular Republican incumbents, and have done you know, fairly well in recent primaries. I mean, you know, to make a segue and transition to this to our next segment. I mean, you had Quad City Prayer Breakfast founder David Pouch challenge Republican Mariannette Miller-Meeks in this last year's primary, and getting about 40% of the vote, I believe. You had Kevin Virgil in Western Iowa, you know, ran a primary campaign against Randy Feenstra and got a similar percentage of the vote. So, you know, it is interesting. There does seem to be, you know, a sizable group of Iowa Republicans who, you know, are interested in that anti-establishment, more MAGA-aligned Trump loyalist. You know, so I guess it will be interesting to see, you know, what type of support Brad Sherman would be able to build, what coalition of Republican supporters he would be able to put together. But, you know, Iowa, as we've seen, has trended more and more red in recent election cycles. And so given that, it's probably not all that surprising, right, to see that the governor, you know, may, or, you know, could draw a primary challenger.
Yep, absolutely. It'll be interesting to see what kind of, you know, to some of those numbers you threw out, what kind of number can Brad Sherman get to against Kim Reynolds? And as Tom said, speaking of Republican primary challengers, I'd say masterful segue, but full disclosure, Tom knows the script, so he knew what was coming next. Eastern Iowa Republican Congresswoman Mariannette Miller-Meeks is going to face a familiar one, assuming she decides to run for re-election this year. She hasn't yet announced it. She hasn't had a slip up yet in a press conference, but we assume that she'll run for another term. David Pouch, as Tom said, who ran against Miller-Meeks in 2024, has already announced his intention to run again in 2026. And Sarah, this is a pretty big deal for some of the reasons that Tom sort of alluded to, right?
Yeah. So that was kind of a lot what I was going to talk about. So that's a good thinking along the same lines. But
Media group think.
So David Pouch announced he's running again. He's doing an announcement, his like official announcement at the state capitol, I believe February 27th, so sometime next week. Last go around, it feels like it was just yesterday. 2024, Pouch got about 44% of the vote, which is a stronger than expected showing considering he raised just $43,000 for that race. And Miller-Meeks, she raised hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars. Most of that was spent during the general election, but she did spend significantly more in the primary than Pouch did. And so, you know, Pouch told me, you know, he lost, but he was getting calls from people. Oh, you know, you did better than expected. And so last year he had announced around Veterans Day ahead of the primary. And so this time he said he wants to make another go at it, announcing earlier, giving him more time for fundraising and getting his name out there more. And I think him announcing at like the state capitol also signals that he's going to try to maybe get some more institutional support.
And media coverage.
And media coverage, yes. As a reminder, David Pouch, he is best known for organizing the Quad Cities Prayer Breakfast, which is an event. They've had speakers like Carrie Lake and Mike Lindell, the My Pillow founder. And David Pouch has really positioned himself as a MAGA candidate who's an early supporter of Trump, who he criticizes Mariannette Miller-Meeks. He paints her as not conservative enough, as not trustworthy to conservative voters. In the 2024 race, he really criticized her votes to protect same-sex marriage and certify the 2020 election. And it sounds like this race, he's been critical of her voting for omnibus bills, and he was critical of a vote that she made, and all the other Iowa House members made. They voted down a bill that would have reduced funding for USAID, which is currently being dismantled by the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. So he repeats a lot of the claims that supporters of DOGE make, that there's a lot of waste and fraud in the federal government, and that he won't just rubber stamp a budget or omnibus bills if he were to be elected. And I reached out to Mariannette Miller-Meeks' campaign to ask if she was running for re-election. They didn't directly answer that. Spokesperson said Mariannette is spending all her energy on helping President Trump implement his agenda. It is not time for campaigning.
But what a coincidence that reaction, that statement included a reference to supporting President Trump.
Right. Yeah. So I think, and we've seen Mariannette Miller-Meeks really back Trump's agenda. I mean, she signed on to the lawsuit against the Des Moines Register over the Iowa poll. Right. So it seems like she's trying to position herself as more of a Trump backer, supporter, further to the right, to try to fend off this primary challenge.
Yeah. And it's fascinating because, we talk about generally the conversation, kind of similar to what I just said about Brad Sherman against Kim Reynolds, is more about how close can they make it. It's not about can they actually win. I should say that there is not terribly in the distant past precedent for a Republican congressperson losing a primary election. But what's fascinating about it is it was in the other direction when it happened to Steve King. He got outflanked by a more, and I say air quotes, moderate candidate, because that's in the eye of the beholder. But I think it's fair to say most people would describe that in that way when Randy Feenstra unseated Steve King in a Republican primary. But that was clearly in the other political direction. And now the challenges, as Tom and Sarah, you have noted, are coming from the even more conservative side of the spectrum. And man, could it actually happen in 2026? I don't know. Todd, the only one of us who's got the shield to give an opinion here, is it possible that one of these folks could actually knock off a Republican incumbent in a primary?
I guess Miller-Meeks would probably be the most vulnerable, just because we've seen her opponent draw a considerable amount of votes in the GOP primary. I'm sure she won't take him lightly this time. Last time, I don't think she totally understood the threat. I mean, Brad Sherman's not going to be governor of Iowa. I mean, that's just not going to happen. He may take an embarrassing number of votes for the governor, but I mean, the Republican Party has a pretty substantial group of people who are very, very conservative. So Brad Sherman will, appeal to those people. He'll get lots of cheers up for some sort of red meat speech at the convention or wherever he gets some attention. But yeah, I don't see any of them being particularly vulnerable, but Miller-Meeks has to take this challenge seriously.
Yeah.
And I'm not really sure what to make of all of it, but Miller-Meeks had a fairly close re-election in the general election, only winning by about 900 or 1,000 votes. So Trump outperformed her in her district. So,
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned, because I was just going to say something to that point, Sarah. I'm sure you're seeing him too. The DCCC is already hitting Mariannette Miller-Meeks on this and that, and I can't remember what it was, the most recent email I saw, but she's dealing with a primary challenge and then having to also be thinking ahead to the general election. So it's a very interesting needle that she's going to have to thread there to win again in 2026, and who knows what the electorate looks like, what the national mood is like in God. I mean, what is it? 19, 20 months out from November, whatever it is, even more than that. So it's just a fascinating tightrope that political tightrope that Mariannette Miller-Meeks is having to walk. All right, plenty of time to talk about that in future episodes. Man, there was a lot to cover. We went a little bit longer than usual. If you're still with us, thanks for sticking us out. That's it for this episode of On Iowa Politics. We hope you enjoyed it. If you're not already, please subscribe to us on your streaming service of choice or on YouTube, where you should also smash that like button. And you can also find the podcast each and every week on your preferred Gazette or Lee newspaper website. And now that you've listened to the On Iowa Politics podcast, make sure you also subscribe to the On Iowa Politics newsletter, where every morning in your inbox you'll receive all the latest politics and government coverage from our team. You can subscribe to that free newsletter at the Gazette's website, thegazette.com. And lastly, don't forget that the work of everyone you heard here today can be found on the pages and websites of the Quad City Times, the Muscatine Journal, the Cedar Rapids Gazette, the Waterloo Falls Courier, the Mesa City Globe Gazette, Council Bluffs Daily Nonpareil, and the Sioux City Journal. For Tom Barton, Maya Marchel Hoff, Sarah Watson, Todd Dorman, and our producer Bailey Chehan, I'm Erin Murphy. Be well, everyone, and be good.